arguments that people who want to get around the force of what Jesus said in Matthew 19:9 and Matthew 5:32, people who want to get around the force of that, this is a happy hunting ground for them. This chapter 7 of 1 Corinthians, and so I hope you've paid attention. We've addressed 2, if not 3, different false teachings from this very chapter. If you have any questions on any of those, it's not too late. Let's begin at verse number 36. Verse number 36, "But if any man think that he behaveth uncomely toward his virgin, if she pass the flower of her age, and needs so require, let him do what he will, he sinneth not, let them marry. Nevertheless, he that standeth steadfast in his heart, having no necessity, but hath power over his own will, and hath so decreed in his heart that he will keep his virgin, doeth well. So then he that giveth her in marriage doeth well, but he that giveth her not in marriage doeth better." Now stopping right there, I was just reading to you from the King James Version. There are some versions, such as the ESV, that have worded this as if what Paul is discussing, as if Paul is speaking to a man regarding his bride to be. And so you'll see, whichever translation you are using will either present it that way or present it as if it's Paul speaking to a father who, being the head of his household, would have the authority to give his daughter unto marriage. And so which one of these is this talking about? Well, I believe the context demands that it's speaking of to a father regarding his daughter. I believe the passage can only be understood properly by looking to the customs of that time. In the ancient Near East, the father had absolute authority over his daughters or any other unmarried person over which he was guardian, including slaves. And if he determined that his daughter should marry, well, she married. And if he determined that his daughter should not marry, she didn't marry. How then could a father behave uncomely or improperly toward his virgin daughter? Some have come up with some ungodly ideas as to what this might be. It's certainly not anything perverted or anything along that line. How could a father then behave himself improperly toward his virgin daughter? Well, for example, if she was old enough to be married and getting close to the end of, how did Paul word it there? To the flower of her age, getting to the point where she might not be able to have children much longer, and she still was not married. Well, that in that society, in ancient society, that would have been a shameful situation. And that would not only bring shame upon the daughter, it would bring shame upon the father for not allowing her to be married. And so in that sense, that's one way the father might behave himself improperly toward his daughter, even though he has the authority to tell her, no, you can't get married. That doesn't mean that if he keeps telling her that it's not going to be shameful for her and for him as well. Sometimes parents would arrange marriages for their children while they were still at a very young age, but let's say that one backs out on that agreement. They become a Christian, and then the person that they've betrothed their daughter to is from a pagan background, and they say, you know what, after all, we're not going. Well, that would also be a shameful situation. These would be great concerns for a father in light of Paul's advice in this chapter. And so therefore, Paul again is reminding them of their liberty in this matter. You can marry or not marry. Neither one of them are a matter of salvation, whether you allow your daughter to marry or not allow her to marry. But again, due to the present distress, Paul says, but if you don't allow them to marry, I think you're better off in that situation because of the present distress. Verse 39 Verse 39, he says, the wife is bound by the law as long as her husband liveth. But if her husband be dead, she is at liberty to be married to whom she will, only in the Lord. And so the permanency of marriage here is noted again in this, in stark contrast to this idea of the Pauline permission that some people would teach from this chapter. No, Paul underlines the permanency of marriage. God intended marriage to be, as we say, until death do us part. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder. Now the wording of this verse in verse number 39 is almost verbatim to what Paul said in Romans 7:2. Let me read Romans 7:2 for you. Paul said, therefore the woman which hath a husband is bound by the law to her husband so long as he liveth. But if the husband be dead, she is loosed from the law of her husband. Almost verbatim, except, as you might notice, one additional thought that Paul adds here at the end, that the widow should remarry only in the Lord. Now this has been a problematic statement for many. To be honest, there's two possible interpretations for this, and both interpretations have merit. And so this is really an area where one must really study the usage of the phrase in the Lord and all that's been said on the issue, and use their own best judgment to keep their conscience clean before the Lord on this issue. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment, but here's the two possible interpretations for this. It either means that the widow is free to remarry, but only to a Christian, or it means the widow is free to remarry, but only within the will of the Lord. In other words, only if the candidate is scripturally able to marry. As I said, both of these interpretations have merit. If you study the phrase in the Lord, you will find that phrase used in similar context to both of those interpretations. And so, but I'll tell you what my view is. My view is that it means within the will of the Lord, and that she can remarry as long as she doesn't violate any of the principles that God has laid out concerning marriage. That is, she can't marry someone who it would be unscriptural to get married to, someone who's not able to be remarried, nor could she violate what Paul said about being unequally yoked. In other words, marry someone who would hinder her from being faithful to the Lord. As long as she marries within those parameters, I think that's what is being discussed here. The fact that a Christian is never told anywhere that it's wrong to marry a non-Christian, and in fact that in this very chapter that Paul emphasizes several times that a Christian can be married to a non-Christian. That's why I believe that's the view here. Furthermore, in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 1, and Colossians 3:19, we see a similar usage. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Does that mean that only children of Christians are to obey the Lord? I don't think so. I think it means within. I think it's applied to all. I think I may have misstated that, and I'm having trouble getting my thoughts together today. But if I didn't make that clear, ask what questions you will, and I'll see if I can get it together. Now, I would always advise taking the safe route in such situations. And so if a widow were to come to me and ask me about this, I would always urge her, you know what? The best thing to do is to marry a Christian, and you know that you're safe, right? There's no doubt. And furthermore, why would you want to marry a non-Christian? Do you not realize how difficult that could make? I mean, do you want to continue to come and worship as a widow, being by yourself in the pew? Do you want to continue that when you could have another option? Do you want to continue for your children and others to be to not see unity between you and your spouse when it comes to religious matters. It just would make more sense to go ahead and marry someone that's a Christian. But just one second. But because of the lack of certainty on this particular phrase, I would never consider disfellowshipping a Christian widow because she marries a non-Christian man. That's come up. Sometimes congregations have sought to disfellowship a Christian widow because she got remarried and it wasn't a Christian, and they looked at this verse, but we lack the degree of certainty on this statement to go that far, I would suggest. Yes, sir, Brother Phil.
The advice that you give any widow or widower,
Yes.
it's the same advice you give them if they sprung back 30 or 40 years back to the first marriage when they got married originally. You should marry a Christian. That is obviously the best situation for all involved. That's been addressed already in previous chapters, kind of some of them.
Absolutely.
Same advice goes at that point because it's going to be a real struggle for you. But I also agree with the statement that you made that, this is a tough situation right in this verse, and understanding it, because you can have a day where you say, I'm kind of on this side. You can also have a day where all of a sudden you say, I'm kind of leaned over on this side.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think anybody should be critical of anybody, whatever decisions they make regarding this. I think that the same issue, I remember years ago we had an elder at Berkeley that we talked about marriage, divorce, and remarriage, and he said, there are a lot of different circumstances that can come up, and he said the safest route that 100% guarantee you is that if you ever divorce, if you don't remarry, you know that you're safe. You'll never have to question that. Okay? You don't have to try to figure out what is and how about and this and that. Try to figure out, what if this fits this situation or whatever. But in this situation right here, if somebody did decide, I would not have an issue if they decided to marry and they had non-Christian as a spouse.
Right.
If they would feel strong with the other way, I wouldn't condemn their thoughts either.
Right. I got into this situation in my very first work. I'd not been there long, and I found out one member of the congregation, her husband used to be one of the elders. He passed on, and she remarried, and the man she remarried was a staunch Baptist. And as strange as that sounds to me, and as unadvisable as such a situation would be, I did not agree with some who were saying we ought to disfellowship this woman. I don't think we lack the certainty on this statement here to do that. And if we're going to do that based on a statement that we have some uncertainty with like that, and then we are consistent with that with other situations, well, we'll be disfellowshipping people left and right over all kinds of things that we don't really know for sure whether they should be.
We also know that the Holy Spirit is clear here.
Yeah.
We're not clear.
Right.
But that's the problem.
Right.
Holy Spirit, we may have to wait till the trumpet sounds to find out exactly what this means.
Mm-hmm.
When we hear it, we're going to say that's exactly what I thought.
Right. And so I think still that just underscores the advice that if there's any doubt, go with the safest route. And so that's what my advice would be to anyone who come to me and ask me, what is a widow, what does this mean? My advice, marry a Christian. That way you don't have to worry about what it means. Nor do you have to worry about the multiplicity of other problems that you will deal with if you marry a non-Christian. Any other questions or comments? They're certainly welcome. Yes.
Even if two Christians marry or like that, you never guarantee that life's going to be easy.
Mm-hmm.
And when the rough times hit, how each one reacts, may or may not break the marriage itself, even if God is such.
Mm-hmm.
And those situations have happened. I've seen it times past where you got
Mm-hmm.
You know, so even marrying a non-Christian, that's riskier in some respects, but also, you know, it's more about the person and their heart than anything else, you know, agree.
I can't imagine, you know, with the things that your marriage may face, the things, you know, death of a child, deaths in your family, various different trials that people who are married for decades go through. I can't imagine how much having to go through that with somebody who doesn't share the same views as I have religiously. You know, Christy and I, thankfully, have always been on the same page, and I don't know why anybody would willingly go through that, especially after they've already been a Christian and been married to a Christian. I don't know why anybody would choose that route. It seems to be a point of weakness to me. I know the individual that I spoke of in my first work. I can't tell you how many, but it was numerous times that I went to her house and studied with her husband, who was the staunch Baptist, trying to convert him. And of course, she was in favor of that, but it never happened. In fact, he passed, and it never happened. And so she wouldn't even have those worries had she just married another Christian. But at any rate, verse number 40. But again, Paul says, but she is happier if she so abide after my judgment. In other words, Paul's saying, but still, I think you're better off if you just don't get married. You know, based on the current, everything he says in this chapter seems to be based on this present distress. And then he says, and I think also I have the Spirit of God. Paul reminding there at the very last words of the chapter that everything I said here, given my thoughts and my judgments on these matters, everything I said, keep it in the context and remember that I speak by the Spirit of God. And so, a clear declaration of inspiration to the Scriptures. So Paul is saying, in the very least, the advice Paul has given in this chapter on marriage has been approved by the Holy Spirit. In the least, it's been approved.
What do you think he means when he says, I think?
And I think also that I think it's rhetoric. I think he's just like we might say it today. You know, this is what I think, and this is my judgment on this matter, and I think I've got 20 years on you. You know, just a way of reminding you. That's my personal thought on that. That's just what rhetoric there, just emphasis, a point of emphasis. I'm reminded of 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 12 and 13 here, where Paul said, we have received not the spirit of the world, but the Spirit which is of God, that we might know the things which are freely given to us of God, which things also we speak, not in words which man's wisdom teacheth, but which the Holy Ghost teacheth, comparing spiritual things with spiritual. And so that brings us to the end of chapter 7. A lot of stuff in this chapter. Well, we spent at least 3 weeks on this, I know. So, any questions before we move on? Well, the next few chapters are quite involved as well. You know, 1 Corinthians can be a difficult book. You know, it's got, and the reading isn't, the translation isn't quite as easy as I would like it to be in certain locations. There's obviously the phrase lost in translation is true. Sometimes there's not a perfect word for word translation, and sometimes little nuances are lost. And 1 Corinthians and Romans are two particular books that I find very difficult with that regard. Romans being the hardest, in my opinion, book in the New Testament. All right, chapter 8. Chapter 8. Now from this point to the first verse of chapter 11, Paul starts to address some other questions that the Corinthians have written to him about. And these questions all seem to have in common, they're about things sacrificed to idols. Now, chapter 8 overview and outline is on the screen behind me. He talks about knowledge versus love. He kind of contrasts those. And then as it pertains to the discussion in this chapter, and then he contrasts God with idols. And then he talks about not being a stumbling block. Now, I think this chapter deserves several introductory thoughts, and I'm going to share with you some that I took from some of the commentaries I found most helpful. Robert Knox, in his introduction to this chapter, says, in this chapter, Paul deals with another question, or possibly questions, plural, on the subject of idols. These questions seem to be as follows. 1, can Christians attend banquets, social gatherings, in idol temples? 2, in a friend's home, can a Christian eat meat that was sacrificed to an idol? 3, can a Christian purchase meat that has been offered to an idol from the marketplace and serve it on his own table at home? That question's more dealt with in the next chapter. Before dealing with this text, which answers the above questions, a look at the cultural background of Corinth would be helpful. These Corinthian Christians had generally grown up as pagans, offering sacrifices to idols. These ancient sacrifices often involved animals, but not all of the animal was sacrificed. Instead, like in the case of Jewish sacrifices, part of the animal was often given back to the one who sacrificed. And that person would then take that meat and they would perhaps have a feast and invite some of their friends and relatives over to share in that. Another portion of the animal was given to the priest to sustain them. And of course, some part of it was offered in the actual sacrifice. But that was given to the priest, if the proper giving took place, it was often way more than their families could even consume before the meat would spoil. And so a lot of that times that extra meat, they would invite people over and share that meat with friends or relatives, or sometimes they would sell that meat in the shambles, as it's the word found in the King James Version in the next chapter, or the marketplace. During special feast times, when there were a whole lot of sacrifices taking place, these marketplaces would be flooded with all kinds of meat for sale. And those meat prices, of course, would be reduced because of how much was available. And so it's easy to see how those who come out of idolatrous worship might be tempted to return to some of these sinful practices, and might be questionable. Some of the other practices might be very questionable. You know, it appears that the instructions that Paul gave in Acts 15, 28, or the instructions that were given in Acts 15, remember that council they had in Jerusalem there regarding meats offered to sacrifices? It seems that maybe that hadn't reached them yet, or they arrogantly believed that they were mature enough to withstand the temptation to go back into idolatry. Here's what we actually find in Acts 15, 28 through 29. For it seemed good to the Holy Ghost and to us to lay no greater burden than these necessary things, that you abstain from meats offered to idols, from blood and from things strangled and from fornication, from which if you keep yourselves you shall do well, fare you well. And so that was the requirements to the Gentiles regarding meats offered to idols, to abstain from them. And so it's easy to see that these former pagan Christians would have been faced with some daily dilemmas regarding their culture of idolatry. And one commentary, Truth for the Day commentary by Dwayne Warden, he gives 4 scenarios that I think that really help us to envision the culture and religious situation there, and what some of these situations might be like that you might be faced with on a day-to-day basis. So let me share with you these 4 scenarios. First scenario, eating meat at a business gathering. First, we might imagine a craftsman, perhaps a blacksmith. And he had learned his trade from his father, and over time he had joined the Corinthian blacksmith guild, a collegium, as the Latin-speaking Romans would have called it. He and other blacksmiths would gather periodically and they would share news about the market. They would share news about the supply of raw materials, and they might perhaps lobby levels of government for policies favorable to their businesses. The gathering place for the guild was in the dining room within the precinct of one of the temples, the temple dedicated to the god of metallurgy. He was Hephaestus to the Greeks, but he was known to the Romans as Vulcan. Prior to the guild meeting, a goat or a pig was dedicated to a god, to the gods, and then its fat portions were burned on the altar, and the flesh of the animal provided meat for the gathering. Meetings began with rituals entreating the god for his favor. Now, just imagine the blacksmith probably might have gave little thought to the deity, and perhaps he thought it would be nice to have supernatural assistance in the daily matter of survival. He is aware of several benefits for his trade that can be gained through the collective voice of the guild, but recently he has become a Christian. And so he's in the process of trying to sort out the implications of this newfound faith for guild membership. Questions had arisen because the guild to which he belonged was associated with a deity. It met often in a temple. It offered libations and sacrifices and ate meat offered to idols. And so he's in a quandary. To disassociate himself from the guild would have serious social and economic consequences. Intellectual, he could be, blacklisted and wouldn't perhaps even be able to serve as a blacksmith if he did so. Intellectually, he realizes that Hephaestus is not even a real god. Vulcan has no power at all. There's no such thing as these little g gods. But years of cultural conditioning made it difficult for him to dismiss the practices that were connected to this pagan god. And so his question to Paul might be like this. His question to Paul was this: when it was a matter of good business, since he understood that God the Father and Jesus Christ the Lord had no peers, could he eat the meat that had been dedicated to an idol in the temple of that idol? He knew the idol was nothing, even if others did not. Did he need to break contract with his friends? That's the first scenario. Now think about that. That would be difficult, right? We might have labor unions, which might be the closest thing today to being in a trade guild during those times, but most of us are not in trade guilds. I don't know of anyone who is. Just imagine if you were, and if you were to break ties with that trade guild, you have to find a new career. How difficult would that be? How easy would it be to rationalize things that you needed to accomplish? And what if ties to that trade guild were related to some unholy, unrighteous practices? And often people do face situations like that. That's scenario one. We ready for scenario two? Any questions on that one? And we're not answering the questions yet, but we will. Scenario number two, eating meat at a social gathering. The second scene involves a woman who might have been in her 40s. She's old enough so that her children no longer absorb all her time. But for the past few years, she has assembled periodically with other women of Corinth at a temple dedicated to Demeter and her mythical daughter Persephone. Both were agricultural deities who were believed to be favorably disposed to women. The meetings were social occasions. The women brought along food. It would be ceremonially dedicated to the goddess by someone there, and it would be prepared on small charcoal fires, and as one pleaded with for Demeter's help in whatever domestic turmoil they faced. And then it would be enjoyed. They would enjoy a little time away from their tasks at home. This woman likewise has recently confessed Christ and obeyed him by putting him on in baptism. Her association with friends was not quite the same as the blacksmith's, but she no doubt had the same question. Could she go to the temple of an idol and share a meal dedicated to the idol without compromising her Christian confession? Now that she was a Christian, she knew that the idol meant nothing. She wondered how she would explain to her friends why she no longer wanted to meet with them. She might have wanted to ask Paul if the confession of Christ required that she separate herself from her lifelong friends. Another difficult situation. I think most of us in this room would, I know how most of us would probably answer both 1 and 2 there. He that gives up father, mother, brother, sister, daughter, we have to love Christ more than these things, right? But these were legitimate questions. Here's another one. Another scenario, eating meat at home. For the third case, let's consider a family who wanted to eat meat at home. Meat for regular meals would have been a rarity in Corinth at the time, but on special occasions, a family might venture to the meat market and buy something. Much of the meat in the marketplace was supplied by the temples of pagan gods. A pagan who needed the help of a god might bring a goat, pig, or even an ox to the god's temple as a gift. The animal would be slaughtered. Fat portions would be burned on the altar, and the rest of the meat would be sold to merchants who took it to the marketplace. The question put to Paul by the Corinthians was this: could Christians serve on their family table meat that had been previously offered to an idol? Good question. All right, scenario number 4, eating meat at a friend's home. Fourth situation is similar to the third, but it raises other questions. This scenario involves eating at someone else's home. What if non-Christians, perhaps family members, extend an invitation for us to dine with them? Could the Christian accept the invitation to eat if he suspected that the meat served at dinner might have been dedicated to a pagan god? And so all these, I think, are scenarios that are related to the things that are discussed in this chapter and the next. And now I'll give you the summary that Dwayne Warden says follows those scenarios up with. He says, questions about eating meat offered to an idol, in particular eating the meat in the idol's temple, were subtle and had delicate nuances. Simple yes or no, right or wrong answers were not given by Paul in such situations, and yet new believers needed clear instruction. As the inspired apostle offered guidance concerning areas in which God had given no specific commands, he relied on careful reasoning. Of course, he admonished all Christians to abandon idolatry, and that meant staying away from idols' temples. They should not even allow people around them to think that they were participating in pagan rituals. Regarding purchases at the marketplace, the wise approach was to avoid asking about the history of a piece of meat. If anyone made a point of saying that the meat being served had been sacrificed to an idol, then the Christian was to make the unmistakable stance against idolatry by foregoing his right to eat it. I think that well summarizes what we're going to read in the chapters. And so we're almost out of time, but questions or comments about that? I don't know if those scenarios helped you. I find them helpful because I like to try to put myself in the text, in the shoes of the audience to whom Paul was writing, and I personally think that I don't always agree with Brother Warden's commentary on things, but I think in this instance he did a good job laying out that context. All right, so chapter 8, verses 1 through 3, we find knowledge contrasted with love. Paul says, now as touching things offered to idols. And so now Paul's changing topics. We're leaving marriage under the present distress, your questions related to that. And now we're going to talk about some of these other questions you've asked, now touching things offered to idols. We know that we all have knowledge. Some translations have their opinions. You know, everybody has an opinion. Everybody knows something, thinks they know something. But knowledge puffeth up, but charity edifieth. So we find two things contrasted here: knowledge and charity, loving, brotherly love. The phrase "we all have knowledge" was possibly a quote from the Corinthian letter that asked the questions. Considering the context, they seem to be saying that we have the knowledge that idols are not really gods. They're only a product of men's hands. And therefore, it seems that they're trying to use that to justify they're going to the market, going to these social gatherings and markets and places and saying there's no reason why we can't do this, right? We understand that these aren't really gods, and so there's nothing inherently wrong with the meat, nor is there anything inherently wrong with the building, because they're not sacred. They're not real gods, and that's the basis, seems to be the basis of their argument. Paul starts out by talking about knowledge can be dangerous in the hands of some, because when people who are very knowledgeable, it's pretty often that they will become proud of the knowledge that they have, and they become arrogant. They start to look down on others because of the knowledge that they have. They think they're superior to others. And Paul is saying that knowledge without love is worthless. Knowledge which leads to arrogance tears down relationships, whereas knowledge coupled with love will build up or edify. Just a couple more statements. I know the bell just rang. When it comes to matters of Christian liberty, what I understand about my liberty is still limited by concerns for other people's well-being. What Paul seems to be getting at is that it's more righteous to give up what one might feel they have the liberty to do because of his love and concern for the good of another. That's a more righteous attitude to have than to, hey, look at all the knowledge I have, I can do this and that, and I've always got a reason why I can do this and that because I've studied, and because of my studies, this is okay. You're down here, I'm up here. That's not preferable. What's preferable is, regardless of what I might have the liberty to do, what's good for you that I do, Okay, we'll pick back up there next week. Appreciate your attention and comments.